"Did you like the apartment I bought you, Mom?" my son asked with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. And for a moment, I thought I had misheard him, that maybe the word apartment had slipped in from some other conversation, some other life, because I had been living in the same small one-bedroom rental for the past 3 years, counting every dollar, measuring my groceries down to the last ounce, and learning how to stretch a bottle of medication far longer than any doctor would recommend. So I simply looked at him across the table and said quietly, "What apartment, Daniel?" The question seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, stretching thin between us like something fragile that could snap at any second. And that was when I noticed Victoria, sitting beside him, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wine glass just a little too hard, her smile freezing in place as if someone had pressed pause on her expression. And then, just for a second, her eyes flickered toward him, sharp and calculating, before she let out a soft laugh that didn't belong in the moment at all. I remember thinking how strange it was, how out of place everything suddenly felt, because this was supposed to be my birthday dinner, something simple, something warm, something I had spent the entire afternoon preparing in my tiny kitchen, standing on aching feet while the oven heated up the apartment that was most definitely not new, not gifted, not anything more than what I could barely afford each month. Daniel leaned back slightly, still smiling, but there was confusion creeping in now, subtle but unmistakable, like a shadow moving across his face. "The apartment on Westbrook Avenue," he said, slower this time, as if repeating it would somehow make it more real. "I bought it for you 2 years ago. You've been living there, haven't you?" I felt something cold settle in my chest, not sharp, not loud, just heavy, like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying until that exact moment, and I shook my head, once steady. "No, honey. I've never seen any apartment on Westbrook Avenue." Silence followed, the kind that doesn't feel empty but full of questions, full of something unspoken, full of a truth that hadn't yet found its way into words, and I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator behind me, the ticking of the old wall clock, the soft clink of silverware as Victoria set her fork down a little too carefully, like she was trying not to make a sound at all. For a long time, I had believed that distance explained everything, that my son's success had simply taken him into a different world, one filled with business trips and meetings and responsibilities I couldn't fully understand, and I had told myself that it was normal for calls to become shorter, for visits to become rare, for holidays to feel more like obligations than traditions, because that's what happens, isn't it? When children grow up and build lives of their own, you step back, you give them space, you accept the quiet. But sitting there, looking at him now, I realized something didn't fit, something had never quite fit, and I just hadn't been ready to see it. Victoria reached for her glass again, but her hand trembled just enough for the wine to ripple slightly, and she quickly set it back down, her smile returning, polished and practiced. "Maybe there's been some kind of misunderstanding," she said lightly, her voice smooth, almost too smooth. "Paperwork gets mixed up all the time. You know how these things are." I turned my head toward her slowly, studying her face, the perfect makeup, the carefully styled hair, the effortless way she seemed to move through every room as if she owned it. And for the first time, I noticed something I hadn't allowed myself to notice before, not clearly, not fully, but enough to make my stomach tighten just a little, because it wasn't just what she said, it was how quickly she said it, how ready she was with an explanation before Daniel even had time to respond. And that was when I understood that whatever this was, it wasn't new. It hadn't just happened tonight. It had been there, quietly unfolding in the background of my life while I was busy surviving, while I was telling myself that everything was fine, that everything made sense. Daniel was already pulling out his phone, his brow furrowed now, the easy confidence replaced by something more focused, more serious. "No, that's not right," he murmured, scrolling quickly. "I have the records. The purchase, the transfers, everything was set up under your name, Mom." "Transfers?" The word echoed in my mind, soft but heavy, and I felt my fingers curl slightly against the edge of the table, because in that moment, something shifted inside me, something quiet but undeniable, a realization forming not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, steady understanding that something had been taken from me long before I even knew to look for it. And as I sat there, listening to the faint sound of Daniel's phone tapping under his fingers, Watching Victoria's carefully controlled expression, I knew that this dinner, this simple birthday I had planned, was no longer about celebrating another year of life. It was about uncovering the truth of the life I had been living without ever being told the full story. I did not sleep much that night, not because of the question itself, but because of what it quietly uncovered, like a loose thread you cannot stop pulling once you notice it. And as I sat alone at my small kitchen table the next morning, the sunlight coming in through the thin curtains that never quite blocked out the street noise, I began to look at my life with a different kind of attention, not the soft acceptance I had carried for years, but something sharper, something more deliberate, as if I were seeing it for the first time instead of living it. The apartment I had been renting for 3 years was modest in every sense of the word, 600 square feet if you measured generously, with a narrow hallway that led into a living room just large enough for a worn sofa and a small coffee table that I had found at a thrift store, the kitchen barely wide enough for one person to move comfortably, and a bedroom that held a single dresser, a nightstand, and a bed that creaked if I shifted too quickly in the middle of the night. And yet I had told myself over and over again that it was enough, that I did not need more, that simplicity was a choice rather than a necessity. I had learned to keep the thermostat lower in the winter, layering sweaters instead of raising the heat. And in the summer, I relied on a small fan that hummed steadily in the corner rather than running the air conditioning for too long. Because every bill mattered, every dollar had a purpose, and there were months when I had to decide carefully which expense could wait and which could not, a quiet balancing act that had become so normal to me that I no longer questioned it. My medication bottles were lined up neatly beside the sink, each one measured, each one stretched just a little further than prescribed, not out of carelessness, but out of necessity, because even with insurance, the costs added up in ways that did not always make sense, and I had convinced myself that this was simply part of growing older, part of managing on a fixed income, part of a life that had naturally become smaller as the years passed. Daniel had always told me not to worry, that he would take care of me, but his words had become something abstract over time, something distant, like a promise made in another room that you can hear but not quite reach. And I had accepted that distance because I believed in him, because I believed that whatever he was doing, wherever he was, it was important, it was necessary, and I did not want to be the kind of mother who asked for more than what was freely given. But now, sitting there with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, I realized that there had been signs, small ones, quiet ones, the kind that are easy to dismiss when you trust someone completely, like the time I mentioned a late fee on my rent and Daniel had looked confused for just a second before quickly changing the subject, or the time I told Victoria that my car needed repairs and she had smiled and said something about how these old cars can be such a burden, without ever asking how. I planned to fix it, and I had brushed those moments aside, told myself they meant nothing, that I was reading too much into ordinary conversations. I stood up slowly and walked over to the small desk by the window, opening the drawer where I kept my bills, my receipts, every piece of paper that documented the careful structure of my life, and I spread them out across the surface one by one, rent payments, utility statements, pharmacy receipts, each one a quiet record of what I had been managing on my own, each one a reminder that nothing had ever come easily, that nothing had ever been handed to me, and yet Daniel had spoken as if something significant had been given, as if there was an entire part of my life that existed without my knowledge. The thought did not come all at once. It built slowly, piece by piece, until it settled into something undeniable, and I felt a strange calm take its place where confusion had been the night before, not the kind of calm that brings comfort, but the kind that comes when you begin to understand that the truth is not going to be simple, that whatever answers you find are going to change the way you see everything that came before. I picked up my phone and stared at it for a moment, my reflection faintly visible on the dark screen, and I realized that for the first time in a long while, I was not waiting for someone else to explain things to me. I was not waiting for reassurance or clarification or a gentle excuse that would smooth everything over. I was ready to look for the answers myself, even if I was not entirely sure what I would find, because somewhere between Daniel's confusion and Victoria's carefully controlled smile, I had begun to understand that my life, as I knew it, might not have been entirely my own. I did not call Daniel that morning, even though the thought crossed my mind more than once. because something told me that whatever answers he had were only part of the story, and I needed to understand the rest before I let anyone explain it to me. So instead I sat down at my small desk again, this time with a different kind of purpose, and began going through everything more carefully, not just the bills and receipts, but the small details I had overlooked before, the dates, the patterns, the gaps that did not make sense when you looked at them closely enough. It was not long before I noticed something that made me pause, a series of bank statements from 2 years ago, neatly stacked but rarely revisited, because at the time there had been nothing unusual about them, nothing that stood out against the quiet routine of deposits and withdrawals that barely kept me afloat. But now, with Daniel's words still echoing in my mind, I saw them differently, and I began to trace the numbers with my finger, slowly, methodically, as if they might reveal something if I gave them enough attention. There were no large deposits, no unexpected transfers, nothing that resembled what he had described, and yet that absence itself felt like a presence, like a missing piece that should have been there, but was not, and I leaned back in my chair, staring at the papers spread out before me, feeling that same quiet weight settle in my chest again. I remembered something then, something small and almost forgettable at the time. A conversation from about 2 years ago when Daniel had visited briefly, just for an afternoon, and he had mentioned setting things up for me, said something about making sure I would not have to worry anymore, and I had smiled, thanked him, and told him he did not need to do that I was managing just fine, and he had insisted, gently but firmly, that it was important to him, that he wanted to take care of me, and I had let the conversation end there, assuming it was just another promise, another expression of concern that would fade into the background of his busy life. But now, sitting there with those old statements in front of me, I realized that conversation had not been as simple as I thought, that something had been set in motion back then, something real, something tangible, and somehow, somewhere along the way, it had never reached me. The realization did not come with anger, not yet. It came with clarity, a slow, steady understanding that I had been standing on the edge of something without realizing it. And now I was beginning to see the shape of it, the outline of a truth that had been carefully kept just out of view. I reached for my phone again, this time not to call Daniel, but to search for something else, something specific, and I typed in the address he had mentioned the night before, Westbrook Avenue, letting the words sit on the screen for a moment before pressing enter. And as the results appeared, I felt a strange sense of anticipation, not excitement, not hope, but something quieter, something more controlled, as if I were preparing myself for whatever I might find. The listing came up quickly, an apartment complex with clean lines and modern finishes. The kind of place that looked far removed from the life I had been living, and I studied the photos carefully, the polished floors, the wide windows, the kitchen that was larger than my entire living area, and I tried to imagine myself there, tried to picture what it would have been like to live in a place like that for the past 2 years, and the image felt unfamiliar, almost distant, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. I scrolled further, looking for anything that might connect me to it, any sign that this place had ever been part of my life. But there was nothing, just listings, descriptions, amenities, details that painted a picture of comfort and stability that I had not experienced in a long time. I set the phone down slowly and looked around my apartment, really looked this time, at the worn edges of the furniture, the small cracks in the walls, the way the afternoon light filtered in through the thin curtains, and I realized that the difference between what I had and what I might have had was not just about space or comfort. It was about something deeper, something that could not be measured in square footage or monthly payments. It was about the life I had been told I did not need to worry about, the security that had been promised but never delivered. And as that realization settled in, I felt something shift again inside me, not confusion this time, not even sadness, but a quiet determination that had been absent for a long time, a sense that whatever had been hidden from me was not going to stay hidden much longer, because I was no longer willing to accept things at face value. I was no longer willing to let silence explain what did not make sense, and as I gathered the papers in front of me and placed them back into the drawer, I knew that the next step was not going to be about waiting. It was going to be about finding the truth, no matter how carefully it had been concealed. The address stayed on my mind longer than I expected, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it felt like it belonged to a version of my life that had existed without me, and that thought alone was enough to make me reach for my coat that afternoon. even though I had not planned to go anywhere. Even though stepping outside meant facing the chill that had settled into the early spring air, the kind that lingers just enough to remind you that winter has not fully let go yet. I told myself I was only going for a walk, something simple, something ordinary, but my feet carried me in a direction that was anything but accidental, and before I could reconsider, I found myself standing at the bus stop 2 blocks from my apartment, watching the traffic pass by in steady streams, my reflection faintly visible in the scratched glass of the shelter. The ride across town took longer than I remembered, the city stretching out in quiet layers, familiar streets giving way to neighborhoods I rarely visited, areas where the buildings looked newer, cleaner, more deliberate in their design. And as the bus came to a stop near Westbrook Avenue, I felt that same calm settle over me again, steady and controlled, as if I had already accepted whatever I was about to see. The apartment complex stood on the corner, exactly as it had appeared on my phone. All clean lines and wide windows, the entrance framed by neatly trimmed shrubs and a polished sign that reflected the afternoon light. And for a moment, I simply stood there, taking it in, trying to reconcile the image in front of me with the life I had been living, trying to understand how something so tangible could have existed just a few miles away without ever touching my reality. I walked up to the entrance slowly, my footsteps measured, not hesitant, but deliberate, as if each step mattered in a way I could not fully explain. And when I reached the door, I paused just long enough to steady myself before stepping inside. The lobby was quiet, softly lit, the kind of space designed to feel welcoming without drawing attention to itself, with comfortable seating arranged near large windows and a reception desk positioned just off to the side. And behind it sat a young woman who looked up as I approached, her expression polite and professional, the kind of expression that suggests she has seen many faces but remembers very few. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice gentle but efficient, and I offered a small smile in return, the kind that feels natural even when everything else does not. "I believe there may have been a mix-up," I said carefully, choosing my words with more attention than usual. "I was told that there is an apartment here under my name." The woman nodded slightly, already turning toward her computer, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard, and for a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the soft tapping of keys and the faint hum of the air conditioning. I watched her face as she read whatever appeared on the screen, and I saw the moment her expression changed, subtle but unmistakable, her posture straightening just a little, her eyes focusing more intently. And then she looked back at me with something that was no longer just routine politeness. "Could I have your name, please?" she asked, and I gave it to her, calmly, clearly, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, even though my heart had begun to beat just a little faster beneath the surface of that calm. She typed again, slower this time, more deliberate, and then she paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard for just a moment before she spoke. "Yes, ma'am," she said, her tone shifting almost imperceptibly. "There is a unit registered under your name." The words settled into the space between us, quiet but heavy, and I felt that same weight return to my chest, not as confusion this time, but as confirmation, as something real and undeniable that no longer existed only in conversation or speculation. "I see," I replied, my voice steady, even, as if I had expected this all along, and in a way, perhaps I had. "Would it be possible to see it?" She hesitated briefly, just long enough for me to notice, before nodding, reaching for a key card from a drawer beside her desk. "Of course," she said, standing up and gesturing toward the hallway behind her. And as I followed her through the quiet corridor, past doors that all looked the same on the outside, I felt a strange sense of distance from myself, as if I were observing someone else walking beside her, someone whose life had just begun to shift in a way that could not be undone. When she stopped in front of one of the doors and held up the key card, there was a brief pause, a moment that seemed to stretch just a little longer than it should have, and then the light on the lock turned green with a soft click, and the door opened inward, revealing a space that was bright, clean, and completely untouched, a place that had been waiting, silently, for someone who had never arrived. For a moment, I did not step inside. I simply stood at the threshold, looking at a space that felt both real and impossible at the same time, because nothing about it matched the life I had been living, Nothing about it carried the small imperfections I had grown used to, the worn edges, the quiet signs of use. Instead, everything here was still, untouched, as if it had been waiting patiently for someone who had never come. And I realized with a quiet certainty that that someone was supposed to be me. The young woman stepped aside to give me room, her presence fading into the background as I took a slow step forward. Then another, my shoes making a soft sound against the polished floor, and I let my eyes move across the room, taking in the wide windows that let in an abundance of natural light. The kitchen with its clean countertops and modern appliances, the living area spacious enough to hold more than just the bare essentials. And I tried to imagine what it would have felt like to wake up here, to move through this space day after day, to exist in a place that suggested comfort instead of careful survival. There were no personal belongings, no furniture, no signs of life at all, just an emptiness that was too deliberate to be accidental. And I walked further in, my steps steady, controlled, as if I were afraid that moving too quickly might disturb something fragile that existed only in my understanding of the moment. "It has not been occupied," the woman said gently behind me, her voice quiet enough that it did not break the stillness of the room, and I turned my head slightly, acknowledging her words without fully looking away from what was in front of me. Not occupied. The phrase settled into my thoughts with a clarity that left no room for doubt, and I felt something shift again, not confusion, not even disbelief, but recognition, because this was no longer a question of whether something had been meant for me. It was proof that it had existed, fully prepared, fully real, and yet entirely absent from my life. I moved toward the window, drawn by the light, and as I looked out over the street below, I saw people going about their day, unaware of the quiet revelation unfolding above them. And I realized how easy it would have been for this place to become part of my story, how seamlessly it could have replaced the small apartment I had accepted as enough. And that realization carried with it a quiet weight. The understanding that what had been taken from me was not just space or comfort, but time. Years of living differently. Years of not having to calculate every expense. Years of believing that my circumstances were simply the result of life moving forward. I turned back slowly, letting my gaze move across the room one more time, and I noticed something I had not seen at first, a small envelope resting on the kitchen counter, placed there as if it had been left intentionally, and I walked toward it with the same measured pace, reaching out to pick it up, my fingers steady even as my thoughts began to settle into something more focused, more precise. The envelope was unsealed, my name written neatly on the front in a handwriting I did not immediately recognize, and I opened it carefully, sliding out a single sheet of paper that felt heavier than it should have, as if the weight came not from the paper itself, but from what it represented. The document was simple, straightforward, a confirmation of ownership, my name printed clearly at the top, the address listed beneath it, the date from 2 years ago standing out in a way that made everything else fade into the background. And I read it once, then again, not because I did not understand it, but because I needed to feel the reality of it settle into place. This had been mine, not in theory, not in promise, but in fact, in record, in something that could not be dismissed or explained away. Behind me, the woman shifted slightly, as if uncertain whether to speak, and I folded the paper carefully, placing it back into the envelope with a calm that felt unfamiliar but steady, a calm that did not come from comfort, but from clarity. "Thank you," I said quietly, turning toward her at last, and she nodded, her expression soft but observant, as if she understood that something significant had just occurred, even if she did not know the details. I walked toward the door without hesitation, the space behind me remaining just as it had been, untouched, waiting, and as I stepped back into the hallway, I realized that whatever had been hidden from me was no longer invisible. It had form, it had proof, it had a place I could stand in and see with my own eyes, and that changed everything. Because now the question was no longer whether something had been taken, but how, and more importantly, why. And as I made my way back toward the lobby, the quiet determination that had begun to form inside me settled into something stronger, something that no longer needed to question itself, because the truth, once seen, could not be unseen, and I was no longer willing to live in a version of my life that had been carefully constructed without my knowledge. I did not rush home after leaving the building, even though there was a part of me that wanted to, a part that wanted to sit in the familiar quiet of my small apartment and process everything that had just unfolded. But instead I walked slowly down the street, the envelope held firmly in my hand, not tightly, not desperately, but with a kind of steady awareness that this small piece of paper had already changed the direction of my thoughts in a way that could not be reversed. The city moved around me as it always did, people passing by with their own concerns, their own destinations, and I found it almost strange that everything else continued as normal when something so significant had shifted in my own life. As if the world had no reason to pause just because I had finally stepped into a truth that had been waiting quietly for 2 years. By the time I reached the bus stop again, my mind was no longer searching for explanations in the abstract. It was moving towards something more concrete, more deliberate, and I knew that the next step was not about gathering more evidence. It was about understanding the people involved, the choices that had been made, and the silence that had allowed all of this to exist without my knowledge. When I returned to my apartment, the space felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because I was no longer looking at it the same way. The worn sofa, the small kitchen, the narrow hallway, all of it now carried a new layer of meaning, not just as the place where I had been living, but as the place where I had been kept, quietly, without question. I set the envelope down on the table and stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me, and then I reached for my phone, not hesitating this time, not waiting for a better moment or a clearer thought, because I understood now that waiting had been part of the problem, that silence had been part of how this had continued for so long. Daniel answered on the third ring, his voice familiar, steady, but there was a hint of distraction in it, the kind that comes from a life filled with constant movement. "Hey, Mom," he said, warm but brief. "Everything okay?" I did not answer immediately, not because I did not know what to say, but because I wanted my words to be as precise as the realization that had led me to this moment. And when I spoke, my voice was calm, even, carrying none of the uncertainty from the night before. "Daniel," I said quietly, "I went to Westbrook Avenue today." There was a pause on the other end of the line, not long, but noticeable, and I could almost hear the shift in his attention, the way his focus sharpened as the meaning of my words settled in. "You went there?" he asked, his tone changing, confusion and something else beginning to surface, something closer to concern. "Yes," I replied, my gaze resting on the envelope in front of me. I spoke to the front desk. They confirmed that the apartment is under my name. Another pause, longer this time, heavier, and I imagined him processing the information, comparing it to what he believed to be true, and I could feel the distance between those two versions of reality beginning to close. "That is what I told you," he said finally, but there was uncertainty in his voice now, a subtle shift that had not been there before. "Then why?" I asked, not raising my voice, not pressing the question with force, but letting it stand on its own, clear and direct. "Have I never lived there?" The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was no longer just a pause. It was a space filled with something unresolved, something that could not be answered with a quick explanation or a simple misunderstanding. And when he spoke again, his voice was slower, more careful. "Mom, I set everything up," he said, as if repeating it would make it more solid. "The purchase, the transfers, the management. Victoria helped coordinate some of it, but everything was supposed to go directly to you." I let his words settle, not interrupting, not reacting immediately, because I was listening not just to what he was saying, but to what was missing, to the gap between his certainty and my reality. "Daniel," I said again, gently but firmly, "there are no transfers in my account, not from you, not from anyone, and the apartment has never been occupied." I heard his breath shift on the other end, a small change that carried more meaning than any words could, and for the first time since this conversation began, I sensed something real in his response, not just confusion, but the beginning of realization, the moment when something that had always made sense suddenly did not. "That is not possible," he said, but the confidence in his voice was fading, replaced by something more uncertain, more fragile. I did not argue with him. I did not try to convince him, because I understood now that the truth did not need to be forced. It only needed to be seen, and I had already seen enough to know that whatever had happened, it had not been an accident. It had not been a simple mistake lost in paperwork or time. It had been something deliberate, something sustained, something that had required silence to exist. I looked down at the envelope once more, my name written clearly across the front, and I felt that same calm settle over me again, steady and unwavering. Not because the situation was simple, but because it was no longer hidden, and as I held the phone to my ear, listening to the quiet on the other end, I knew that this was no longer just a conversation. It was the beginning of something that would not be easily undone, because once the truth begins to surface, it does not stop at the edges. It moves forward, uncovering everything in its path, whether you are ready for it or not. Daniel did not hang up after that, even though neither of us spoke for several seconds, and I could hear something shifting on his end of the line, not just physically, but mentally, as if he were moving through layers of assumptions that no longer held together the way they used to. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, more focused. "Stay there," he said, not as a command, but as a decision he had already made. "I am going to check everything right now." I did not ask what that meant. I did not interrupt or question him, because I understood that whatever he needed to see, he had to see it for himself. And so I simply said, "All right," and ended the call, setting the phone down beside the envelope, the room around me returning to its usual stillness, though it no longer felt the same. Time moved differently after that, not faster, not slower, but with a kind of weight that made each minute feel more defined, more noticeable, and I found myself sitting at the table again, my hands resting lightly in front of me, not fidgeting, not restless, just present, as if I were waiting for something I already knew was coming, even if I did not know exactly what form it would take. It was nearly an hour later when my phone rang again, Daniel's name appearing on the screen, and I answered it on the first ring this time, not out of urgency, but out of readiness. He did not greet me the way he usually did. There was no casual warmth, no attempt to ease into the conversation, only a quiet intensity that came through immediately. "Mom," he said, and then he stopped, as if he needed to choose his next words carefully. "I have been looking through the records." I said nothing, allowing the silence to hold space for whatever he needed to say next, and when he continued, there was something in his voice that had not been there before, something heavier, something closer to disbelief than confusion. "The purchase is real," he said slowly. "The deed is in your name, just like I told you, and the monthly transfers have been going out every month for the past 2 years." I closed my eyes briefly, not in surprise, not in reaction, but in acknowledgement, because this was no longer about uncertainty. This was confirmation of what I had already begun to understand. "Then where did it go?" I asked quietly, not accusing, not pressing, just placing the question where it belonged. There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear him breathing, a little heavier now, as if the answer was something he was not ready to say out loud yet. "The account it was sent to," he began, then stopped again, and I could almost picture him staring at the screen in front of him, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "It is not yours." The words settled between us, simple but definitive, and I felt that same calm return, steady and unwavering, because this was the moment when everything shifted from possibility to truth. "Whose is it?" I asked, my voice unchanged, even, controlled, and for a moment, there was only silence, the kind that carries weight not because of what is said, but because of what is about to be said. When he finally answered, his voice was lower, tighter, as if each word required more effort than the last. "It is under Victoria's management account," he said, and there was no mistaking the realization in his tone now, no mistaking the way the pieces had come together in a way neither of us could ignore. I did not respond immediately, not because I did not understand, but because I wanted to let the truth settle fully, without interruption, without reaction, because this was not a moment that needed to be rushed. "She handled the coordination," he continued, almost to himself, as if retracing his own steps. "I trusted her to make sure everything was set up correctly. I never thought." He did not finish the sentence, and he did not need to, because the meaning was already clear, the trust, the assumption, the quiet reliance that had allowed this to happen without question. I looked around my apartment again, at the same details I had seen every day for years, but now they felt different, not because they had changed, but because I finally understood why they had never changed, why my life had remained so carefully contained while something else existed just out of reach. "Daniel," I said softly, not interrupting his thoughts, but grounding the moment in something steady. This has been happening for 2 years. There was a sharp inhale on the other end, a reaction he could not fully control, and I could hear the weight of that realization settling into him now, not just as information, but as something personal, something that carried consequences beyond numbers and accounts. I did not know, he said, and for the first time since this began, his voice carried something raw, something unfiltered, not just confusion or disbelief, but the beginning of responsibility, the understanding that this was not just a mistake, it was something that had been allowed to continue because it had never been questioned. I believe you, I replied, and I meant it, not because I was choosing to trust him blindly, but because I could hear the shift in him, the moment where his certainty had broken and something more honest had taken its place. Another silence followed, but this one was different. It was no longer filled with uncertainty. It was filled with clarity, with the weight of what had been uncovered, and I knew that this was only the beginning, not the end, because the truth, once revealed, does not resolve itself. It demands to be faced, to be understood, to be addressed. And as I held the phone to my ear, listening to my son on the other end of the line, I realized that whatever came next would not be about discovering what had happened. It would be about what we chose to do with it, and that choice, for the first time in a long time, felt like it belonged to me as much as it did to anyone else. Daniel did not call back immediately after that last exchange, and I did not expect him to, because there are moments when silence is not avoidance, but processing, when a person needs to sit with what they have learned before they can decide what it means, and I understood that now, perhaps more clearly than I ever had before. The apartment around me felt smaller that evening, not physically, but in the way it held my attention, as if every detail was now part of a larger question, every object a reminder of something that should have been different, and yet I moved through it the same way I always had, preparing a simple dinner, rinsing dishes, placing them carefully in the rack, my hands steady, my movements precise, because routine has a way of grounding you when everything else begins to shift. It was not until later that night, when the room had grown quiet and the city outside had softened into distant sounds, that my phone rang again, Daniel's name appearing once more, and this time, when I answered, there was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty left unspoken. I spoke to Victoria, he said, his tone firm, controlled, but carrying an edge that had not been there before, something sharper, something resolved. I did not ask what had been said, I did not interrupt, because I knew he would tell me what mattered, and I could hear it in the way he continued, each word chosen carefully, each sentence deliberate. She said it was temporary, he went on, and I could almost see the tension in his expression through the phone, that she redirected the transfers into an account she managed because she thought it would be easier to consolidate everything in one place, that she was planning to move it over to you once everything was organized. He paused, just long enough for the explanation to settle, and I let it sit there, not rejecting it, not accepting it, simply allowing it to exist as it was. And the apartment? I asked quietly, because that was the part that could not be explained away with numbers or accounts. There was a brief silence, shorter this time, more controlled. She said she wanted to have it fully furnished before telling you. He replied, and I could hear the strain beneath the words now, the way the explanation did not quite hold its shape under its own weight. She said she did not want you to move into an empty place. I closed my eyes for a moment, not in frustration, not in disbelief, but in recognition, because the explanation, though carefully constructed, carried something unmistakable within it, a tone that suggested intention rather than oversight, a pattern that aligned too neatly with what I had already seen. Daniel, I said gently, not challenging him, not dismissing what he had been told. The apartment has been empty for 2 years. The statement did not require emphasis. It did not need to be repeated. It simply existed as fact, clear and unmovable. And on the other end of the line, I heard his breath shift again, the sound of someone coming to terms with something they could no longer reinterpret. I know, he said quietly, and this time there was no defense in his voice, no attempt to bridge the gap between explanation and reality, only acknowledgement. I went through everything again after we spoke, he continued, slower now, more deliberate. The transfers were consistent, every month, the same amount, and they never reached you, not once. I let the words settle, not reacting immediately, because I wanted to hear what came next, not just what had happened, but what he intended to do with that knowledge. I asked her why, he said, and there was a pause, a slight hesitation. And she said she was managing it for us, that she thought it was better to handle everything centrally, that she did not want you to worry about finances. The sentence lingered in the air, and I felt something shift again inside me. Not anger, not even disappointment, but clarity, the kind that comes when a pattern becomes too clear to ignore, when intention reveals itself through repetition rather than admission. Did you believe her? I asked, not accusing, not pressing, just placing the question where it belonged, between what he had heard and what he now understood. There was no immediate answer, and I did not expect one, because belief is not something that changes instantly. It shifts slowly, piece by piece, until what once felt certain no longer holds. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, steadier. I believed her before, he said, but I cannot ignore what I am seeing now. I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it, because that was all that needed to be said, not a declaration, not a confrontation, but an acknowledgement of the shift that had taken place. The room around me remained unchanged, the same small space I had lived in for years, but it no longer felt like the boundary of my world. It felt like a starting point, a place I had been standing without realizing there was more beyond it. And as I listened to my son on the other end of the line, I understood that this was not the moment where everything would be resolved. It was the moment where everything had become visible, where the truth had moved from quiet suspicion into something that could no longer be explained away, and that visibility carried with it a different kind of weight, one that did not demand immediate action, but made inaction impossible, because once you see clearly, you cannot return to not knowing, and whatever came next would not be guided by assumptions or silence, but by the reality that had finally come into view. The next morning did not feel different in the way I once thought important days should. There was no sudden clarity, no dramatic shift in the air, just the same quiet light filtering through the curtains, the same soft hum of the city waking up beyond my window. And yet something had settled inside me overnight, something steady and unshakable, not an emotion, not even a decision, but a clarity that did not require urgency to prove its strength. I moved through my usual routine without rushing, making coffee, placing a slice of bread in the toaster, setting the small table the way I always had. But this time, each action felt intentional rather than habitual, as if I were no longer simply moving through my life, but consciously choosing how I occupied it. The envelope rested on the table beside my cup, exactly where I had left it, and I reached for it not with hesitation, but with a quiet certainty, opening it once more and looking at the document inside, not because I needed to confirm what it said, but because I understood now that this was not just a piece of paper, it was a point of reference, something real that existed outside of explanations and assumptions. When my phone rang, I was already expecting it, not because Daniel had told me he would call, but because I knew that what had been uncovered could not be left unresolved. And when I answered, his voice carried a clarity that matched my own, not calm in the sense of ease, but calm in the sense of direction. "I have scheduled a meeting," he said, his words direct, deliberate, "with my attorney this afternoon, and I want you there." I did not respond immediately, not because I was uncertain, but because I was considering what that meant, not just in terms of action, but in terms of everything that had led us here. And when I spoke, my voice remained steady, even. "I will be there," I said, and that was enough. The rest of the day unfolded without distraction, as if everything unnecessary had quietly stepped aside, leaving only what mattered. And when I arrived at the office later that afternoon, I noticed how different it felt to walk into a space knowing that I belonged there, not as a guest, not as an afterthought, but as someone whose presence was essential. Daniel was already waiting when I entered, his posture more rigid than usual, his expression focused in a way I had not seen before. And when he looked at me, there was no confusion left, only recognition, not just of what had happened, but of what needed to happen next. Victoria was not there, and I did not ask about her, because her absence spoke for itself, a quiet acknowledgement that this was no longer a situation that could be managed behind closed doors or explained away with carefully chosen words. The meeting itself was straightforward, Not dramatic, not confrontational, but precise, guided by facts rather than emotions. And as the attorney reviewed the documents, the transfers, the ownership records, everything aligned with what we had already discovered, each detail reinforcing the same conclusion, that what had been presented as management had in reality been control. And that control had been exercised without my knowledge for far longer than it should have been allowed. I listened without interruption, my attention fixed not on the explanation itself, but on the structure of it, the way everything had been arranged, the consistency of the transfers, the deliberate nature of the decisions that had been made. And I understood then that this was never about a misunderstanding. It was about intention, sustained and justified through silence. When the attorney asked how we wished to proceed, Daniel turned toward me, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, and in that moment, I saw clearly the shift that had taken place, not just in him, but in the space between us, where assumptions had once filled the gaps. There was now something more solid, something that did not rely on trust alone, but on clarity. I did not rush to answer. I did not react emotionally or seek to assign blame, because I understood that what mattered now was not what had been done, but what would be done next. And after a brief pause, I spoke, my voice calm, measured, and certain. "We will correct it," I said simply, because that was the truth of it. Not revenge, not confrontation, but correction, the restoration of something that had been taken without acknowledgement. And as the conversation moved forward from there, outlining the steps that would follow, the adjustments that would be made, the accountability that would be required, I felt something settle fully into place within me, something that had been building since the moment that simple question had been asked. And I realized that this was not the end of a story, but the beginning of a different one where I was no longer defined by what I had been given or denied, but by what I chose to see, to understand, and to reclaim. And as I left the office that day, stepping back into the quiet rhythm of the city, I did not feel smaller. I did not feel overlooked. I felt present in a way I had not felt in years, grounded not in what had been promised, but in what I now knew to be true. And that truth, once found, was something no one could quietly take away again.